What if I told you there were days when the scaffold meant to be the stage for justice turned into a madhouse of failure, fear, and doubt, where the executioner himself lost control and the crowd saw the state's mask slip? Tonight, we unspool the most infamous botched executions in history, from a headsman chasing a 70-year-old noblewoman across the platform, to a queen's head rolling free of a wig, to a humane electric chair, coughing smoke. And if you dare to keep your eyes open while we peel back the ceremony to expose the chaos underneath, hit subscribe now, because this descent is just beginning. Public executions were supposed to be a choreography of certainty. The drum roll, the proclamation, the measured prayer, the clean tool. They were designed to convert terror into trust, to convince a restless crowd that law had hands steady enough to cut only what it meant to cut. But the truth is simpler and darker. Humans ran the show, and humans tremble, miscalculate, improvise, and when everything fails in front of witnesses, they remind us that power depends on the illusion that nothing can go wrong. Consider Margaret Pole, a relic of Plantagenet blood, standing on damp timber in 1541, an elderly woman neither cowed by age nor soothed by ritual. When told to lay her head upon the block, she answered with defiance, "Traitors did that, and she was none." And in that instant, the neat script tore down the middle, leaving a nervous axeman clutching steel that suddenly felt heavier than the throne's will. He swung and missed the mark, a glancing strike that drew gasps rather than closure, and what followed looked less like judgment than panic. Margaret staggered bloodied but unbroken in spirit and fled around the scaffold, while the executioner, shaking, pursued with clumsy, desperate arcs. Every failed blow widened the horror. Every thud of boot on plank told the crowd that the blade was not a symbol of order, but a tool in unsteady hands. Witnesses would later insist that the memory outlived the moment. Nausea spreading like a fever, faces averted murmurs, curdling into pleas for it to end. Not because the sentence was disputed, but because the state appeared inept at the very act it claimed to perfect. And from that stain came a quiet change. The realization that a headsman must be more than strong. He must be trained, because when death is public, clumsiness becomes policy. Decades later, another spectacle promised immaculate control. Mary, Queen of Scots, stood before a hall layered with procedure, prayer, and pageantry. The executioners had rehearsed the steps in their minds, the swing, the silence, the display. But history kept its taste for irony, and the first stroke landed not on the neck but behind the head, a miscue that drew a low human sound and made the hall itself hold its breath. The second stroke nearly severed, but not enough, forcing a third smaller cut to conclude the act. Then came the moment arranged for triumph. The headsman lifted the prize to cry allegiance. Only the hair slipped in his hand, because it was a wig, and the true head, pale and frail, fell and rolled with a grotesque finality that vacuumed the air from the room. Eyes widened, prayers halted mid-syllable, and a theological theater collapsed into a shuddering lesson about the fragility of control. 2 royal botches in a century taught rulers an unlovely truth. When justice fails in public, it breeds doubt faster than any pamphlet. And yet the ritual persisted, as if repetition could repair faith, as if more banners, more officials, more measured voices could prevent wood from splitting, rope from slipping, iron from sparking. But soon, a city of artists would discover that even the stage itself could betray the performance. Florence, 1498. The square packed the spectacle elevated on a massive wooden platform, and the man at the center, Savonarola, whose own bonfires had devoured vanities, now tied to a post to taste the flames he had preached. Only the platform collapsed with a crack that echoed off stone, tumbling bodies and beams into a messy heap, turning solemn justice into slapstick calamity in an instant, and sending officials scrambling not for words, but for anything that still held weight. Improvisation replaced ritual, as debris became a crooked pyre, and posts were lashed back into service. The fire burned unevenly, smoke swirling ugly, and the crowd left with the wrong conversation in their mouths. Not salvation, not justice, but incompetent carpenters and supervisors who forgot to check the stage. From then on, cities whispered a new rule into their procedures. Inspect the scaffold plan for failure, because when the platform buckles, the idea of authority buckles with it. The lesson from Florence echoed quietly through Europe. Execution was not merely a punishment, it was a performance. And if the stage props collapsed, then the illusion of divine justice collapsed with them. Rulers learned to measure wood train, headsmen, and even choreograph prayers because the smallest crack could split confidence in an empire that claimed to be eternal. Yet, centuries later, in the age of science and electricity, another spectacle was staged with the same promise of precision, the very first use of the electric chair. Designed in polished oak with gleaming brass, it was meant to look dignified, almost civilized, as if death could be delivered like a gentleman's handshake, instant and clean. But the condemned man, William Kemmler, did not pass swiftly into silence. The first current jolted his body rigid. The physician pronounced him gone. And then in front of horrified witnesses, his chest began to rise again, breath forcing its way back into a chamber that had already written his epitaph. Panic broke among officials. The numbers had been calculated, the volts precise, the promise scientific. Yet here was a dead man breathing, groaning, gasping, mocking the new machinery. With the sheer persistence of life, and the crowd of journalists and doctors shifted from curiosity to revulsion. The switch was thrown again, harder, longer, merciless. This time, smoke curled upward, hair burned, leather straps smoldered, and the sickly sweet odor of cooked flesh spread through the room, driving witnesses to the edge of nausea. It was meant to be humane, but it resembled torture perfected by wires. When it was over, the electric chair's reputation as the civilized successor to axe and rope was already in ashes. One newspaper sneered that an axe would have been kinder, and Westinghouse himself quipped that the state could have done better with a carpenter's tool than with Edison's dazzling invention. Technology had promised to fix the ancient mess of human error, yet technology only magnified the horror when it faltered. And just as the scaffold boards had snapped under Savonarola, the electric chair had cracked under Kemmler, reminding all who watched that there is no such thing as clean killing, only killing that hides its stains better. But perhaps no execution in history exposed the fragility of authority more than the case of Robert-François Damiens in Paris, 1757, sentenced to be torn apart by horses for the crime of striking at a king. A sentence meant to terrify a nation instead turned into a 4-hour carnival of incompetence. The horses chosen were not the powerful draft beasts required, but tired carriage animals that strained and slipped, pulling without coordination, leaving Damien screaming, but intact, stretched like a living rack before thousands of restless eyes. The crowd began to murmur. Nobles squirmed in their seats, and the grandeur of monarchy looked ridiculous. For hours, the failure dragged on until executioners took knives to tendons trying to help the horses finish their gruesome task. What was supposed to be a swift display of absolute royal power became a grotesque butcher's workshop in front of Paris itself, and the philosopher Voltaire would later cite this very scene as proof that torture was not justice but barbarism, unfit for a modern age. By the time Damien's body finally gave way, limb by limb, pulled apart in painful sequence, Paris had witnessed not the majesty of monarchy but its clumsiness, its cruelty and its loss of dignity. The intended warning to traitors became a rallying cry for reformers who argued that when justice itself looks like a nightmare, the people will begin to question the throne. The Enlightenment seized on that moment. Pamphlets circulated, philosophers debated, and the horror of Damien's failed dismemberment became fuel for the growing fire against public torture. It was as though the monarchy, by mishandling one man's execution, had helped draft the script for its own downfall. Yet even as France edged toward revolution, England was scripting its own horror upon the scaffold the case of Anthony Babington and his conspirators against Queen Elizabeth I, whose executions would reveal just how fine the line was between accepted brutality and unacceptable cruelty in the eyes of a Tudor crowd. The law decreed the traitors should be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment already infamous for its severity. But what unfolded with Babington himself shocked even those hardened by years of watching blood spill at Tyburn. Babington was hanged only briefly, just enough to ensure he remained fully conscious. When he was cut down, he faced the next stages awake and aware of feeling every slice, every act of disembowelment, as his innards were cast into the fire before his eyes. The crowd, who had come expecting horror, suddenly felt complicit in a cruelty that stripped even execution of its grim decorum. Murmurs grew into shouts. Witnesses demanded mercy. Some even surged forward as if to stop the execution themselves. The theater of punishment had backfired, turning spectators into protesters, and the Queen herself, hearing of the scandal, intervened with a rare mid-execution order. For the remaining conspirators, Elizabeth decreed that the hanging should continue long enough for unconsciousness, perhaps death before the mutilation began. It was still brutal, still terrible, but it drew the line back to what the public could endure without revolt. In that moment, the monarchy bent to the will of its audience, not out of kindness, but out of necessity, for even a sovereign understood that if the crowd turned against the spectacle, the crown itself risked losing its aura of righteous power. What unites Margaret Pole's desperate flight, Mary's slipping head, Savonarola's collapsing stage, Kemmler's smoldering body, Damien's 4-hour agony, and Babington's conscious disembowelment is not merely cruelty, but failure of ritual, of planning, of illusion. Each time the mask of controlled justice cracked open to reveal chaos, and each time society changed better-trained headsmen, stricter scaffolding rules, rethought execution methods, or gradual abolition of public torture. It was as if history itself kept demanding through horror that power admit its fallibility and that rulers confront the simple truth that no matter how carefully choreographed, death refuses to obey the script. These disasters remind us that executions were never just punishments. They were performances carefully staged to project stability. When they collapsed into chaos, they didn't just scar the condemned, they scarred the audience, searing into memory the image of rulers who could not even control the moment of death. In the Chronicles of Tudor England, for example, reports of Margaret Pole's stumbling, bloody flight from the scaffold, carried on for generations, whispered as proof that divine justice had refused to bless Henry VIII's vengeance, turning a political execution into a parable of royal cruelty and incompetence. Likewise, the grisly farce of Mary Queen of Scots' beheading echoed across Europe, feeding Catholic propaganda that Elizabeth's reign was not one of order and justice, but one stained by humiliation. Her enemies painted the botched death as a cosmic sign that Protestant England itself was unstable. In Florence, the collapsing platform of Savonarola became more than an accident of carpentry. It was taken as divine irony, the stage itself rebelling against the show of authority, and many in Italy repeated the story with a smirk, mocking not the monk, but the officials who managed to trip over their own execution. When the electric chair failed to deliver its clean promise, newspapers turned the chamber into a circus of horror, portraying Kemmler's smoking body as the proof that modern science was no less barbaric than medieval torture. Instead of advancing civilization, the machine seemed to drag humanity back into darkness with a new clinical mask. And in Paris, the prolonged torment of Damien whispered into the ears of philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot, who seized upon it as an argument that kings were not enlightened guardians, but relics of savagery, unfit for an age that aspired to reason and dignity. The Babington spectacle showed most starkly how even ordinary people in a brutal age had their limits. The crowd's outrage forced Elizabeth's court to adjust midstream, proving that public opinion was itself a power no ruler could ignore, even when it came to enforcing the harshest laws. Each failed execution became a pivot point in history, not because of the crime committed, but because of the spectacle gone wrong. When the audience left not awed, but horrified at the incompetence, the entire system of punishment bent under the weight of its own contradictions. The rulers had wanted to stage morality plays where justice triumphed in clean precision, but history delivered tragedies of error and humiliation, where the very act of killing undermined the authority it was meant to secure. In these moments, the scaffold became less a throne of law than a mirror of power's weakness. And so, beneath the blood and fire, these stories endure not as curiosities of cruelty, but as warnings that whenever power turns human suffering into theater, it must accept that the stage may collapse. The actors may falter, and the audience may turn away, not in obedience but in disgust. From England to France, from Italy to America, the pattern was the same. Executions were engineered to be acts of control, yet the very moment control slipped, they became spectacles of shame. Rulers could decree death, but they could not choreograph perfection, and the people watching remembered every mistake longer than every proclamation. In the aftermath, chronicles recorded the horror not with the cold neutrality of law, but with the heated language of trauma. Witnesses of Margaret Pole's death described vomiting nobles at Mary's beheading, whispered in fear. Florentine citizens laughed nervously at the collapsed pyre, and American reporters fled the smoke of the first electric chair, all carrying away the sense that the state's hand was less steady than it claimed. The psychology of the crowd was crucial when executions went smoothly. They reinforced obedience, but when they went wrong, they planted doubt, sometimes even pity. And in that pity lay the seeds of reform. For if the state could not kill without error, how could it claim infallibility in life? Over centuries, these mishandled deaths accumulated into a gallery of grim lessons, better training for executioners' laws to limit public torture, and eventually the quiet migration of executions from open squares into hidden chambers away from the public eye that might recoil if the ritual misfired again. But secrecy was not the same as perfection. Behind closed doors, failures still happened, ropes snapped chemicals, miscalculated machinery jammed, and though fewer eyes witnessed them, the stories leaked reminding societies that technology or procedure could not scrub away the essential brutality of the act. Margaret Pole's chase, Mary's rolling head, Savonarola's collapsing stage, Kemmler's burning body, Damien's stretched limbs, Babington's conscious torment. All these moments tell one larger truth. Power tried to cloak itself in order, but death resists choreography and error exposes the system's deepest contradictions. For the condemned, botched executions were hellish tragedies. For the witnesses, they were haunting scars, and for rulers, they were dangerous embarrassments, proof that justice, staged as theater, risked turning into parody, capable of undermining faith in the very structures it sought to defend. Even centuries later, historians and storytellers return to these failures, not simply for their grotesque detail, but because they reveal something timeless, that power, when stripped of polish, is vulnerable, fallible, and sometimes ridiculous, no matter how many guards, banners, or priests surround the scaffold. To study these moments is to confront the fragility of authority itself, to realize that every throne, every regime, however mighty, risks being remembered not for its victories, but for the day the axe missed the stage, collapsed, the machine smoked, or the horses failed to pull. And that is why these stories endure not as curiosities in the margins of history, but as central reminders that when punishment becomes spectacle, the true audience is not the condemned, but society itself learning sometimes against its will that even in death the state can stumble and expose the limits of its power. The irony is impossible to ignore. Kings and queens, popes and judges all believed that by putting death on display they could write a message of invincibility into the minds of their subjects. Yet, whenever the blade slipped or the rope broke, the opposite message was written, one of human weakness of a system pretending to be divine, but cracking under pressure. Some chroniclers noted that people left botched executions not feeling safer, but feeling unsettled, whispering that perhaps heaven itself had intervened. When Margaret Pole ran bleeding across the scaffold, many thought it was a sign that God was rejecting the king's cruelty, and when Mary's head rolled free of its wig, it was interpreted as divine humiliation of Elizabeth's justice. The collapse of Savonarola's pyre was likewise retold as a cosmic joke, the very fire refusing to burn neatly for the man who had once made a religion out of bonfires. The crowd laughed nervously, but behind the laughter was a shiver, the sense that destiny itself mocked the pretense of control. The electric chair born from modern science should have silenced superstition forever, but its failure only replaced demons with dread. Instead of witches and curses, witnesses whispered of faulty currents, and botched science and newspapers gleefully reminded readers that the civilized world was not so far from medieval horror after all. In Paris, the horror of Damien stretched across 4 hours too long for even the most bloodthirsty to endure. As he lay, stretched but alive, many in the crowd shifted from delight to pity, and in that pity philosophers like Voltaire found ammunition proof that brutality was no longer strength but evidence of a regime too barbaric to survive. The Babington execution marked an even stranger shift. The crowd, normally compliant, dared to shout against what they were seeing, and in doing so they bent the Queen's will. Elizabeth's order to soften the cruelty of the remaining executions was not born of mercy, but of politics acknowledging that even monarchs could not force the public to stomach everything. In each case, a single body on a scaffold shaped something larger. Margaret Pole hardened the notion of trained executioners. Mary's debacle weakened the propaganda of Elizabeth. Savonarola's collapse embarrassed a whole city. Kemmler's smoldering death cast doubt on new technology. Damien's fueled Enlightenment reform. And Babington proved that the voice of the crowd could for a moment push back against the crown. These weren't accidents lost to time. They were failures that bent history's trajectory, leaving behind not just grisly anecdotes, but reforms, revolutions, and whispered doubts that slowly eroded the old certainties of absolute power. And perhaps that is the ultimate horror, not just the screams, the smoke, the blood, but the realization that states, no matter how powerful, depend on rituals as fragile as wood rope or wire, and that a single failure in front of witnesses can make the mighty look absurd. That fragility is why modern executions moved behind closed doors, away from the public gaze. No ruler could risk another Margaret Pole stumbling across the stage, another Mary's head rolling, another Damien's writhing for hours, because once the people see the mask slip, they never quite believe in the mask again. Yet secrecy never erased the memory. The echoes of those public failures still haunt the way we think about justice today, like ghosts rattling the bars of forgotten courtyards, reminding us that law dressed up as theater is always one mistake away from collapse. Margaret Pole's chase across the scaffold is still studied not as an execution, but as a spectacle of chaos. Her refusal to lay down her desperate flight and the executioner's trembling pursuit became the stuff of legend, retold as proof that even a condemned woman could defy the king's script. Mary, Queen of Scots' beheading, remains one of the most infamous in European memory, not for her crime, nor for the political storm that led to it, but for the grotesque reveal of her wig and the rolling of her severed head across the floor. It was a scene that scarred all who watched, a reminder that even royal ritual could dissolve into farce. Florence never forgot Savonarola's toppled platform. For centuries, Italians repeated the tale with dark humor, a warning that even the most carefully constructed displays of power might crumble under their own weight, leaving rulers mocked instead of feared. The electric chair's nightmare debut became international news, a scandal that embarrassed not just New York, but the entire idea of scientific mercy. And though it would continue to be used, its reputation never fully recovered from the smoke and smell of William Kemmler's botched execution. Damien's prolonged agony in Paris was no isolated cruelty. It became a philosophical turning point cited by thinkers and reformers as the event that proved torture was unsustainable, that monarchies' claim to divine justice had rotted into little more than barbarism on display. The Babington conspirators' ordeal revealed another dimension, that even in an age hardened by blood, the public had limits. Their collective recoil forced Elizabeth's court to soften its methods. Mid-execution, an extraordinary moment when the will of the crowd shaped the crown's performance of justice. Collectively, these failures show us something chilling. Executions were meant to terrify the condemned, but often it was the onlookers who carried the deeper trauma home, whispering about what they had seen, questioning whether the state truly had control, or whether justice was just a mask slipping in the wind. And when those whispers grew, they did more damage than any pamphlet or sermon could have achieved. They turned botched executions into symbols, cautionary tales that endured long after thrones fell and kingdoms fractured because the images were too vivid to be forgotten. That is why we remember them today, not because we crave gore, but because they reveal the truth behind the facade that power, no matter how carefully it scripts its rituals, is vulnerable to error. And in that vulnerability we glimpse the humanity, the weakness, and the eventual downfall of those who believed they could rule through fear alone.